The wind howled across the barren landscape of the outpost, its icy fingers scraping against the crumbling remnants of human ingenuity. The desolate planet, once home to millions, now stood in silent defiance, a forgotten corner of the galaxy where the last vestiges of humanity clung to life like a flickering flame in the dark. Captain Eve Anderson stood on the observation deck, her eyes scanning the horizon. The planet's dying sun cast long shadows, painting the cracked earth in hues of orange and red. There was no beauty here, no promise of rebirth, only the slow, grinding march of time that had long since abandoned its mercy. Eve's fingers brushed the faded insignia on her chest, once a symbol of unity and strength, now a relic of a world that no longer existed. She turned away from the window, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the worn map spread across the table. It was a map of human territory, though territory was a stretch. Humanity's reach now amounted to a handful of scattered colonies, each struggling to survive under the oppressive boot of alien invaders. "Captain," a voice broke the silence, bringing Eve back to the present. It was Sergeant Lila Voss, a tough, no-nonsense soldier with a reputation for getting things done when it mattered most. Her face was grim, as always, but there was something else there, a spark of hope that refused to die. Maybe it was contagious. "Report," Eve said, her voice a calm whisper amidst the chaos in her mind. She folded her arms, waiting for the news. Whatever it was, she knew it wouldn't be good. "We intercepted a Galacian transport ship, Captain," Lila said, her voice low but steady. "It's heading to the northern sector. They've been making regular runs, hauling supplies to their command base. But this time, it's different." "Different how?" Eve's brow furrowed. They'd hit Galacian supply lines before, but each time the aliens seemed more prepared. "What makes this one special?" Lila hesitated, glancing at the others in the room. The rest of the team had gathered around the table, watching closely. No one spoke, but their eyes told the story. Everyone was waiting for the thread of hope that might unravel this nightmare. "It's a new class of ship," Lila continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've never seen anything like it before. Heavily armed. And it's carrying something important. We intercepted their encrypted comms. They're transporting something off-world, an asset, perhaps, something that could change the tide." Eve's pulse quickened. This was the opportunity she'd been waiting for. The humans had no chance against the Galatians in open battle. But if they could hit them where it hurt, catch them off guard. "Get me a team together. We're hitting it tonight." Eve's command was decisive, cutting through the tension like a knife. There was no time to waste. Lila nodded and stepped away, issuing orders to the others. As they began to prepare, Eve stood in the middle of the room, thinking. Every move they made was a risk, a gamble against impossible odds. But it was all they had left. The sky had darkened by the time Eve and her small team boarded the transport ship. Their target, a massive, sleek vessel, hovered in the atmosphere like a dark sentinel, its sleek hull gleaming under the cold light of the distant stars. Eve could see the outline of it, massive and intimidating. She didn't flinch. She'd faced worse. Lila was at the controls, guiding their ship toward the Galacian transport. They'd taken every precaution to avoid detection, using the debris field of a nearby asteroid belt to mask their approach. The tension inside the ship was palpable. Each of them knew what was at stake. One wrong move, and it would be over before it began. Eve tapped her fingers on the console, lost in thought. She could already feel the weight of the mission pressing down on her. She wasn't just leading a raid. She was leading the last hope for humanity's future. "Ready, Captain," Lila said, her voice breaking Eve's thoughts. The time had come. Eve nodded sharply. "Go." The infiltration was swift, calculated. The team moved through the shadows of the Galacian transport, using the ship's own systems against it. They bypassed security protocols, disabled cameras, and avoided detection. They made their way toward the central cargo hold, where the mysterious asset was being stored. Eve crouched in the hallway, signaling the others to stop. She could hear voices ahead, alien, guttural sounds that sent a chill down her spine. The Galatians were more alien than anything she had ever encountered. They weren't like humans, with emotions and empathy. They were predators, calculating and ruthless. "Stay low," Eve whispered. "And keep your focus. This is our moment." The team moved forward, staying out of sight. Eve's heart raced. They reached the cargo hold door, which was heavily guarded. She nodded to Lila, who silently moved to disable the security lock. 5 seconds, Lila muttered. The seconds felt like hours. Eve's grip tightened on her weapon as the lock clicked open. "Now." They burst into the room, weapons raised. The guards barely had time to react before they were taken down in a flurry of controlled violence. Eve scanned the room. The asset was in the center, enclosed in a secure container. A quick check confirmed it was exactly what they had hoped for, a Galatian prototype weapon, something that could turn the tide of the war. Eve took a step toward it, but then something caught her attention. A faint sound, footsteps, too many to count, echoed from the hallway. "We've got company," Lila said, her voice steady, but there was a note of urgency there. "We need to move, now." Eve didn't hesitate. "Get the weapon. We're not leaving empty-handed." As the team began to secure the weapon, Eve's mind raced. This was just the beginning. They had the Galatians on the run now, but they wouldn't be fooled again. Zorath, the alien overlord who commanded the Galacian Empire, had underestimated humanity once. That was a mistake he wouldn't make again. But what Zorath didn't know was that the last human hero wasn't going down without a fight. The mission wasn't over yet. And Eve wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The hum of the engines reverberated through the steel hull of the Resistance ship, filling the silence with an unsettling rhythm. Eve stood at the control station, staring out into the black void of space. The stars were distant pinpricks of light, indifferent to the struggle unfolding beneath them. But that didn't matter. The fight was here, in the dark, and it was far from over. The weapon they had seized from the Galatian transport was already being examined by the engineers, its technology alien and incomprehensible to most of them. But one thing was clear, it was powerful. Eve could sense it. The only question was, could they use it before the Galatians retaliated? "Captain," Lila's voice cut through the silence, drawing Eve's gaze. She had joined Eve at the control station, her face etched with the fatigue of the past few days. "Talk to me," Eve said, her voice low but urgent. They didn't have time for pleasantries. Lila's eyes were sharp, focused. "The Galatians aren't blind. We know they'll be on our tail soon. The strike team we sent to sabotage the northern supply line hasn't returned yet. They should have been back by now." Eve's jaw tightened. "If they've been compromised, we don't leave them behind. Get ready for a diversionary strike. We'll hit them before they can regroup." "But Captain," Lila hesitated, clearly concerned. "The diversion could expose us. We might be walking into a trap." "That's why it has to be a surprise," Eve snapped, her eyes hard. "We don't wait for them to come to us. We take the fight to them. They won't expect it." Lila gave a nod, though her concern remained. "Understood." Eve turned away, moving to the tactical map that covered one entire wall of the room. The faint glow of the lights highlighted the fragmented human colonies spread across the galaxy. Their positions were vulnerable, each one isolated and scattered. It didn't help that most of their communications were being intercepted by the Galatians. But Eve wasn't just any commander. She knew how to fight under the worst conditions, how to turn the smallest advantage into a weapon. "We strike fast, and we strike hard," Eve said, her voice resolute. "We can't afford to wait around and hope for a miracle. We've got one shot at this." Lila stood beside her, watching the map. "And what about the Galatian flagship? Zoratha's forces have concentrated there. The last thing we need is to engage them head-on." Eve's fingers tapped the surface of the table, her mind working through the possibilities. Zorath. The name sent a shiver down her spine. He was the architect of humanity's downfall, the one who had orchestrated the invasion and decimation of their homeworld. Eve had heard stories, whispered rumors of his ruthlessness. A creature who could erase entire civilizations with a mere thought. But there was one thing he didn't know: humanity's tenacity. "We won't engage directly," Eve replied, her eyes narrowing. "But we'll make him aware we're here. I want to send a message, a reminder that humanity's spirit is alive and well." The team gathered in the war room a few hours later, the air thick with tension. Eve stood at the head of the table, her hands resting on the map. Around her, the resistance leaders exchanged glances, their faces drawn with exhaustion but determined. It had been a long time since they had a victory, an actual win. The successful raid on the Galacian transport had given them a brief glimmer of hope, but Eve knew it wouldn't last unless they acted quickly. "Listen up," Eve said, her voice firm. "We've lost too many to the Galatians. Entire worlds have fallen. We've bled for this fight, and we're not about to let their arrogance be our undoing. We're hitting Zoratha's supply base at the outer rim. I want it to be quick. I want it to be devastating. We send a message they won't forget." One of the resistance commanders, a grizzled veteran named Nash, spoke up. "But Captain, we don't know how many ships they've got stationed there. We could be walking into a fleet of battleships." Eve met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "We don't have the luxury of waiting for perfect intel. The Galatians are too big, too confident. They think we've been wiped out. They laugh at us, thinking we're nothing but ashes. It's time to show them what happens when they underestimate humanity." There was a murmur of agreement around the room. The plan was risky, but in their current position, risk was all they had. They didn't have the resources for a drawn-out conflict, but what they did have was the ability to hit fast and hard. Eve wasn't about to let their enemies forget the last human hero. The mission unfolded swiftly. The night before the strike, Eve couldn't sleep. She sat alone in the control room, staring at the darkened stars beyond. The weight of the responsibility pressed on her shoulders. Every decision she made was a gamble. Every move, a potential death sentence for someone under her command. But she was a leader. And leaders did what was necessary. As the team prepared for the attack, Eve checked in with Lila one final time. "How's the diversion looking?" she asked, the steel in her voice returning. Lila's eyes were sharp. "We've got the best shot we're going to get. The Galatians are focused on the northern quadrant. Once we launch the decoy, they won't know what hit them." Eve nodded, her mind already running the scenario over and over. "Good. Let's make sure they feel it. We're not just going to take their supplies. We're going to hit them where it hurts." Hours later, the Resistance's fleet emerged from the shadows of an asteroid belt, a ghostly formation of ships gliding toward the Galatian base. The Galatians were unaware, their attention distracted by the feint on the northern side of their operations. Eve's command ship led the charge, cutting through space like a blade, and for a brief moment, everything seemed quiet, too quiet. But Eve knew better. The quiet before the storm was always the most dangerous. "Now," she muttered under her breath. The strike began in a blinding flash. Missiles tore through the void, striking the Galatian base with precision. The response from the enemy was immediate. Alien ships scrambled to retaliate, their weapons lighting up the darkness. But it was too late. The Resistance had already done its damage, and the Galatians were scrambling to respond. "This is our moment," Eve said, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Push forward. We're not backing down." The fight raged for hours. Resistance forces clashed with the Galatian fleet, but Eve could sense the tide shifting. The Galatians, caught off guard and underprepared, were reeling. The element of surprise had worked. As the dust began to settle, Eve stood on the bridge of her ship, watching as the last of the Galatian ships retreated into the depths of space. A momentary silence fell over the crew, broken only by the hum of the engines. They had done it. Against all odds, they had struck a blow. "Report," Eve said, her voice steady, almost cold. Lila turned toward her, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "We've hit them hard, Captain. The supply base is crippled. They're pulling back." Eve's lips curled into a grim smile. "Let them retreat. We'll be waiting for them." humanity had just taken its first step toward revenge. And Eve wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The silence in the command room was suffocating. Eve stood before the holographic display, eyes fixed on the rotating image of the Galacian flagship. Zoratha's pride, his symbol of dominance in the galaxy. It was massive, almost like a fortress, with dark metallic walls that gleamed in the void of space. The ship was an embodiment of everything humanity had been fighting against, a constant reminder of their invaders' overwhelming strength. "Captain, we've received confirmation," Lila's voice broke through Eve's thoughts. "The Galatians are regrouping. They're retreating, but not far. They're planning to consolidate forces at Zoratha's flagship." Eve didn't respond immediately. She traced her fingers over the map, calculating their options. The Galacian fleet was formidable, but they had something the aliens didn't: human ingenuity, speed, and desperation. Every minute they wasted in hesitation was another minute the enemy could use to recover. Eve had made a choice. The time for hiding was over. "We're hitting them," Eve finally said, her tone sharp and decisive. "Full assault. We have one shot to take down the flagship before they can regroup." Lila's eyes widened slightly. "Captain, are you sure? We're still recovering from the last strike. Our fleet is smaller, less equipped than theirs. If we attack head-on, we could lose everything." Eve turned to face her, her gaze unwavering. "I've seen what happens when we play it safe. We don't have the luxury of a long-term strategy anymore. If we want to make a difference, we have to make a statement, now." A long silence passed between them, thick with the weight of their decisions. Lila knew Eve was right. The future of humanity depended on this very moment. If they hesitated, it could all be over. But if they acted, they might just stand a chance. "Let's do it," Lila said quietly, though the resolve in her voice was unmistakable. The fleet moved swiftly, cloaking themselves in the shadows of nearby asteroids. The Galatians had deployed a heavy defensive perimeter around their flagship, but Eve's strategy was simple: strike fast, hit hard, and keep them off balance. The longer they could keep Zorath guessing, the better their chances. Eve stood at the helm of the lead ship, her hand resting lightly on the controls. The bridge crew was tense, but there was a fire in their eyes. They knew the risks, and they knew what was at stake. "All ships, ready your weapons," Eve ordered, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Target their engines. We're not here for a fight, we're here to disable them." The ships advanced, drawing closer to the flagship. Eve's breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of their actions pressing against her chest. The Galatians hadn't noticed them yet. They wouldn't until it was too late. "Captain," Nash, the grizzled veteran, called from the tactical station, his voice laced with urgency. "We've got incoming fire from their defense perimeter. Shields holding, but we're taking damage. Return fire." Eve snapped. "Focus on the turrets. We need to clear a path." The sound of weapons fire erupted, shaking the ship as the crew worked in tandem, their movements fluid despite the chaos. Eve's mind raced, calculations running faster than she could process. They had the element of surprise, but for how long? "Firing main cannons," Lila called out. The ship lurched as a blast of energy tore through space, striking one of the Galatian turrets. It exploded in a cascade of light, sending debris spinning into the void. "Nice shot," Eve muttered under her breath, but she didn't have time for praise. "Not yet. Keep pushing forward. We need to make a direct assault on the flagship. No detours." They closed the distance, and Eve could see the massive form of Zoratha's ship now looming large before them. Her pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. "Captain," Lila said again, her voice more strained this time. "They've detected us. The flagship is locking onto our position." "Brace for impact," Eve ordered, as the ship shuddered under the force of incoming fire. Their shields held, but the blast knocked them off course. The Galatians were closing in, and their counterattack was swift and brutal. "We need to disable their weapons," Eve muttered, more to herself than anyone else. She turned to the crew. "Can we breach their hull?" get inside?" Nash nodded. "We've got the tools. If we can get close enough, we can breach one of their external sections and board." "Do it," Eve said, without hesitation. "Prepare for boarding." The fleet engaged in a vicious firefight, laser beams cutting through the blackness of space. Eve's ship led the charge, skirting close to the flagship's outer hull, weaving through debris and counterattacks. Her heart raced as the distance closed. "Ready the boarding team," she ordered. "Lila, get us in position. Nash, prepare the breaching charges." The ship bucked and groaned as they neared the flagship. Every fiber of Eve's being screamed with tension, but she didn't allow herself the luxury of fear. The moment they breached, the battle would be decided in hand-to-hand combat. A fight that would determine the future of humanity. "Now!" Lila shouted. With a deafening explosion, the outer hull of the Galacian flagship split open, and the resistance team stormed through the breach. Eve's boots hit the alien metal, her rifle raised, her eyes scanning the dark corridors. The Galatians hadn't expected them to come through this way. The corridor was eerily silent, the only sound the hum of the ship's failing systems. Eve's team moved quickly, each member covering the other, their breaths shallow as they navigated the winding halls of the flagship. "Keep moving," Eve barked, her voice low and urgent. "We're not here for sightseeing." As they reached the command center, the doors slammed open, revealing a darkened chamber filled with Galatian soldiers. The battle was brutal, alien soldiers firing blinding pulses of energy, resistance fighters moving with deadly precision. Eve fought with everything she had, her movements sharp and fluid, every instinct honed by years of war. And then, there he was, Zorath, standing at the far end of the room. His form was imposing, a towering figure in dark, intricately designed armor. His eyes glowed with cold fury as they locked onto Eve. "You," he hissed, his voice deep, mocking. "The last human. How pathetic." Eve's lips curled into a smile. "I'm not the last one," she said, her voice low and filled with defiance. "But I will be the one to bring you down." With a swift motion, Zorath raised his weapon, firing a blast of searing energy toward her. Eve ducked, rolling to the side and firing back. The fight was fierce, their weapons sparking off each other as they clashed in the heart of the enemy's fortress. It wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. But in that moment, Eve knew one thing for sure: humanity was still standing, and they weren't going down without a fight.